So back in 2016, as part of the series of videos I did called Freud and Beyond, one of those videos addressed the topic of the death instinct or the death drive. And I conceptually clarified a lot of the confusion around this concept. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that 10 or 15 minutes out of that video and plug it into this new video that I'm making tonight. And then I'm going to come back and elaborate because much more needs to be said about the concept of the death drive. And I'm going to be addressing some remarks made recently by Chomsky that bear on this, and I'm going to speak about some of Erich Fromm's ideas from his great late work, The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness. Okay. Just before we leave Klein, I looked through the list of concepts and I realized there's one very important concept and issue that I didn't address last week, and that's the whole issue of the death instinct. Freud posited this idea in 1920 in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and when he first advanced the idea of a death instinct, he really seemed to, he did advance it as a biologically grounded hypothesis. Here's the drive. It's a drive. It's a death drive. He defines the drive as something rooted in a somatic source. So this is a biologically grounded instinct to die. I don't think it's been widely recognized, but I've always seen this as his break with Darwin. Because, of course, as I pointed out, he grew up under the aegis of Darwinism. The Origin of Species was published 3 years after he was born. His teachers were passionate Darwinists, man is an animal. And from a Darwinian point of view, a death instinct makes no sense whatsoever. Because from a Darwinian point of view, it's about life. It's about the survival. So here he is positing a death instinct. This is a break with Darwin in significant ways. The other thing he does is he advances his two new drives, Eros and Thanatos, with capitalized Greek names. Eros, Thanatos. It's like he's describing gods or metaphysical principles. In a certain way, one can see this as a break with his early psychobiology and his positivism, and his move into something much more like metaphysics almost. He's moving into philosophy here. Of course, he was constantly saying hostile things about philosophy, but here he's moving into philosophy in a significant way. And he knows this, because he knows that his Eros Thanatos is a repeat of what the pre-Socratic philosopher Empedocles had said. Empedocles saw all of life as the outcome of a conflict between philia and nikos, love and strife. So all reality is a manifestation of a conflict. Freud is saying something very similar here. Most analysts rejected the concept of a death instinct. Didn't make sense to them. What they did was they translated death instinct into aggressive drive, which is not what Freud meant. For Freud, even in 1920, aggression is not an independent drive, it's outwardly deflected death instinct. What's primary is masochism, and by masochism I mean here the wish to die. So the death instinct is primary masochism, but under the influence of Eros, which wants us to live, the death instinct is deflected away from the self, outward onto others, as an aggressive drive. So that means that aggression is secondary to masochism.
this is a reversal of what Freud had thought earlier on in certain ways. Anyway, the mainstream translated death instinct into aggressive instinct, and this was very neat because now you had the baby is born all id with drives, a sex drive and an aggressive drive. That's what certainly the Americans did with it, and many of the Europeans did with Freudian theory as well, just basically sidestepping the whole idea of a death instinct. Klein apparently is one of the exceptions. She seems to endorse the concept of the death instinct, and the idea of the death instinct in the minds of many people is very much associated with Kleinian analysis. Kleinians often use the word death instinct, death drive. But when you actually look at the Kleinian literature, you never know what a Kleinian means by the term death drive or death instinct, except by carefully studying the context in which they use it. Very rarely do they seem to mean by death instinct what Freud meant by it, a biologically based instinct to die. They mean many other things. Sometimes they mean human destructiveness. Sometimes they mean a death wish. Now, a death wish is very different than a death drive. A death wish is a psychological thing. We see death wishes all the time. Wishes for other people's deaths, wishes for my own death. That's psychology. That's not the same thing as a death drive that's rooted in a biological need. Sometimes by death instinct, the Kleinians seem to mean annihilation anxiety, the fear of being annihilated. But that would only be because aggressiveness has been projected out, and now it's coming back at me in a way that feels like it's threatening to annihilate me. So annihilation anxiety is a very different concept certainly than Freud's idea of a death instinct. So in the Kleinian literature, when you encounter the word death instinct, you've got to pay very careful attention to try to figure out what the heck this author means by it, because very often it's not at all obvious what is meant by the term. Well, what about Mrs. Klein herself? She does use the words death instinct, and this is one of the two explanations that she gives as to why the baby will always be paranoid, will always have persecutory anxiety, no matter how good and attuned and empathic the caretakers are. No mother can rescue the baby from being paranoid. She gives two explanations as to why. One is that the baby is saddled with a death instinct, and the baby has to project it out. And so he projects the death instinct into the breast, and now feels paranoid, he feels persecuted, he feels that he's being attacked by a predator. The all bad part object of the paranoid schizoid position is loaded with the death instinct that I project out. And so this destructive thing is coming back at me. I'm paranoid. That's one explanation. But wherever she gives that explanation, on I would say almost every page where she gives that explanation, she goes on to give a second explanation as to why the baby must be paranoid. Because not even the best mother in the world can save the baby from frustration. And frustration generates aggression. And the aggression will be projected, making the part object breast into a persecutor. The way Klein sometimes puts it, and Bion follows her in this, the absent good breast is felt, is experienced as a present bad attacking breast. The absent good breast is felt or experienced as a bad attacking breast. The absent good breast frustrates me, generates aggression, the aggression is projected, and I feel myself being attacked. The first of the two explanations, death instinct, has never made any sense to me. I've never accepted Freud's death instinct, and I have never accepted the death instinct as Klein when she writes those words. But her second explanation as to why babies have to be paranoid has always made sense to me. Because doesn't matter how attuned the self-object caretaker is, there will be frustration, and there will be aggression, and the aggression will be projected, and the baby will be paranoid. And this then ties into the other big myth about Melanie Klein, which actually we'll see tonight Winnicott contributes to this myth, which is that Klein denies the role of the real mother. You hear this over and over again in the secondary literature. I personally just feel it's utterly untrue. Anyone who reads Melanie Klein will see that it's not true, because she's constantly emphasizing that the only thing that can rescue the child from its inevitable paranoia is the goodness of the real mother. It's only by taking in the goodness of the real mother that the baby's feelings of persecution can be offset. Okay, so there's the good mother in Klein over and over again. I mean, I could quote you so many passages where she says this so clearly. So where's the denial of the real mother? Now, I think if some of the people who would say this were here, they would say, yes, Don, okay, we'll grant you that she recognizes the role of the real mother and her goodness as being important, but she never talks about the bad mother. She never talks about the mother as an active agent of destruction. She talks about the need for a good mother, but she doesn't talk about the bad mother. Maybe she doesn't enough, but I mean, I don't know how you can talk about the importance of the necessity of the good mother to offset the paranoia without implicitly acknowledging that some mothers are going to do that poorly, and some are going to do it well. In other words, a really good mother is going to very successfully offset the paranoia. A mother who is cold, absent, emotionally dead, whatever, is not going to be sufficiently a loving presence to counteract the paranoia. That's bad mothering, or inadequate mothering. So I feel that the mother really, in both of her incarnations, is there in Klein. It's true that Klein doesn't engage in mother bashing, because she understands that babies come into the world already with a temperament, with little personality. Well, personality is too much, but marked temperamental differences. And she's very well aware that a mother who is very good at offsetting 3 of her 4 babies' paranoia doesn't connect properly with the 4th child, because they just can't dance. They're all over one another's feet. They just don't connect. And that has something to do with what the baby brings to the table, not just with what the mother brings to the table. So that Kleinians, have never gotten into that thing that Bruno Bettelheim got into, the refrigerator mother as the cause of schizophrenia, that kind of thing. The Kleinians were always, like as with Margaret Moll, are also always aware that severe derailments in infancy, it takes 2 to tango, and it takes 2 to not tango. And if things go really wrong, it's not just the mother. I don't know, sometimes it may be 90% the mother and 10% the infant. Sometimes it'll be 90% something going on with the infant and only 10% the mother. That's very complicated. I'm just trying to make the point that Klein was not into mother bashing. But because she was not into mother bashing, some analysts, John Bowlby in particular, accused her of just ignoring the role of the real mother in her psychology. And that's a real distortion. I like John Bowlby's work. I think he's made important contributions to psychoanalysis, but I've never been able to forgive him for spreading that particular myth. Winnicott felt the same. I mean, Winnicott was supervised by Klein. Winnicott as well. We'll see that. We'll see that tonight. That's really the point I wanted to make about death instinct. Okay, you never know what a Kleinian means by that unless you really study carefully the context in which the term is used, and the fact that every time Klein mentions it, she gives this alternative and, to me, much preferable explanation as to why all babies have to be paranoid, and the importance of the mother in alleviating that. Okay.
Okay, that's what I had to say in 2016. And I was really trying to clarify the great confusion around the concept of the death drive. I wanted to point out that very few people who actually use the term mean what Freud meant by it. That is, as a biologically grounded impulse towards literal death, not a death wish, not destructiveness, but a biologically given universal impulse to die. That's what Freud meant by the concept. The Americans, of course, couldn't accept this. They translated it into the idea of an aggressive drive, which is not what Freud meant. Klein seems to have given it an object relational meaning. That is, mostly by death drive, she seems to have meant an object-related fantasy of destroying or of being destroyed, which is, again, not the same thing as a death drive. That's a fantasy of me killing someone or of someone killing me. That's a fantasy of destruction. It's not a death drive in the Freudian sense. I also pointed out that wherever Klein mentioned the concept of the death drive to explain her view that all babies will inevitably be paranoid, one possible explanation for that is that the baby must project the death drive out, and then it comes back in the form of an attack, a fantasy of an attack by an all-bad persecutory part object. In order to live, the death drive is projected out into the bad breast. Now I am being attacked by the all-bad persecutor. Everywhere she mentions that explanation, she usually goes on to say that the absent good breast is felt as a bad attacking breast. That is, the absent good breast, that's a situation of frustration. No mother is good enough to save the baby from all frustration. In the face of frustration, the infant becomes aggressive, the aggression is projected out, and then comes back as an attacker. So here the explanation is not projection of a death drive. The explanation is frustration, leading to aggression, projected, and then feeling attacked. Very different explanations. She always gives us these two explanations, and as I explained, I never accepted the first. I've always felt that the second contains a great deal of truth. Okay, all of that is conceptual clarification. I did not, at that time, go on to say anything more about the kind of destructiveness that we see in the clinical situation, and of course we see plenty of this. We see self-destructiveness. Most people with any kind of self-awareness have some awareness of their tendencies to defeat themselves, to injure themselves, to harm themselves, to sabotage themselves. Sports commentators frequently point out that when athletes reach a certain level of talent, everything then depends on their psychology, whether they allow themselves to win or whether they defeat themselves. So there isn't a lot of mystery around human self-destructiveness, and there's probably even less mystery around the facts of our destructiveness towards others. So human destructiveness is a reality, and we certainly see it clinically. The great Kleinian Herbert Rosenfeld, in a collection of his papers published, I think, in 1987, Impasse and Interpretation is the title of the book, and I think it's either chapter 12 or 13. He writes a chapter called Destructive Narcissism and the Death Drive. And I was intrigued to see how he, I figured this was going to be some kind of clinically based defense of the Freudian idea of the death instinct, but of course that's not what Rosenfeld does at all. Here's the opening paragraph, or not the opening paragraph of the paper, but of one section on the death instinct. Rosenfeld writes that in the last 10 years, I have made further detailed observations and have changed my views insofar as I believe that some deadly force inside the patient, resembling Freud's description of the death instinct, exists and can be clinically observed. In some patients, this destructive force manifests itself as a chronic paralyzing resistance which can hold up analysis for many years. Okay, he has come to believe in a deadly force in the patient that in some ways resembles, underline the word resembles, Freud's description of the death drive. Now, the statement is kind of unremarkable in the sense that, he says in the last 10 years, psychoanalysts have, I think, almost from the beginning, observed in their patients clinically an often deadly force that constitutes a major resistance to the analysis, a resistance to the patient's recovery, a resistance to the patient getting well, getting better. Freud called it the superego. I've spoken elsewhere about Freud's very divided views of the superego. In Civilization and Its Discontents, he describes the superego as a good cop that kind of saves us from a descent into barbarism, but in his clinical work, he describes the sadistic superego as an internal saboteur, to use Fairbairn's description of the same internal enemy. Freud, in a late paper, calls for the demolition of the superego. Franz Alexander, Sándor Ferenczi agreed with Freud that the demolition, or as I've come to think, the relative disempowerment, or deconstruction of the superego is the central therapeutic task. So we're describing a force, the superego, that opposes growth, health, life. It's an internal saboteur. The goal of analysis is to disempower it. I have argued that we have to know in what ways it needs to be modulated. That was James Strachey's idea, not the elimination of it, and that makes sense. I don't think we ever entirely eliminate the superego. Strachey wanted to modify it, but Strachey failed to deal with the question, how do we know in what ways to modify it? In other words, Strachey had no concept of a conscience separate from the superego. Freud had no concept of a conscience separate from the superego, but of course that is exactly what we need. We need the concept of a conscience which can tell us in which ways the superego needs to be modified. That is, it needs to be modified towards truth and away from lies. It needs to be modified towards life and away from death. It needs to be modified away from hate towards love. And of course, that is what conscience tells us. So, while I'm glad that Rosenfeld in the past 10 years discovered this deadly force, but I don't think it was such a great discovery. I think Freud knew about this deadly force. And it is the superego, and it does oppose health and life. Rosenfeld goes on to say a little bit more about this. A couple of pages later, page 109, he says, when analyzing clinical symptoms such as the wish to die or to withdraw into a state of nothingness or deadness, which at first sight might be thought of as a manifestation or as manifestations of the death instinct, described by Freud as a primary drive towards death, I have generally, on more detailed investigation, discovered that some active destructiveness is involved, which was directed by the self not only against objects but against parts of the self. In 1971, I called this destructive narcissism, by which I meant that destructive aspects of the self are idealized and submitted to. Okay, again, he's saying it resembles what Freud called the death drive, but it is not the same thing as Freud's death drive in that it is, we're doing psychology here, not psychobiology. He's talking about a destructive psychological force that opposes the treatment, opposes health and life and growth. And Freud himself says pretty much the same thing about the superego. So really there's nothing terribly new in Rosenfeld's observations here. However, he goes on in this paper to provide some meaningful and useful clinical descriptions of this deadly force. In a broad sense, I think we encounter this force, this destructive force, in all patients. In higher level patients, neurotic patients, patients working primarily in the depressive position, this takes the form of milder resistances, but obviously there are resistances to health and happiness, otherwise the patient wouldn't be spending the time and the money in analysis. So even in neurotic patients we see this destructive force at work. Much more clearly in borderline and psychotic patients do we see it. Um, okay, human destructiveness. Um, so I recently reread Erich Fromm's The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, which I had read many decades ago. I don't think at that time I was really fully ready to entirely absorb what Fromm was saying. In fact, I think I must have done a fairly superficial reading, because I remember feeling, well, what new has Fromm contributed here? He's talking about these two types of character, biophilia, and necrophilia. Is he doing anything more than coming up with new names for Freud's eros and thanatos? Of course, that is a superficial reading, because Fromm makes very clear that while his biophilia, that is, life-loving characters who love life, who love the earth, who love others, he does argue that has a biological basis. That is grounded in the living organism, and in that sense it does closely resemble Freud's eros. For Fromm, it's not a particularly specifically sexual, it doesn't have a sexual basis, and that's a difference with Freud. For Freud, eros centrally means connected to the sexual drive, but it's broader than that. It's a general drive to connect and to integrate, but still, Freud sees it as directly associated with the sex drive. Fromm sees it as biologically grounded, but not narrowly connected necessarily with sexuality, but a much broader sense of love. I think it would include sexual love, but a general principle of life and of the love of life and love of the living. This would include a drive to protect life, to enhance life, to nurture life. But by his concept of necrophilia, or the necrophilic character, Fromm is not at all talking about a universally human, biologically given drive towards death. Not at all. Necrophilia is a pathology. It is not a universally given principle, as was Freud's thanatos. Necrophilia refers to a pathological character type, an illness, a pathology, a perversion in a real sense. The love of life has gotten blocked. Love has gotten blocked. This is a person who has turned to hate from love and has turned to death from life. Fromm acknowledges there could possibly be certain inborn genetic elements that might predispose a person to develop this kind of character. Environmental factors, the quality of the mothering. Fromm is not engaging in any simple mother bashing. Maybe it's some kind of interaction between a specific infant with a specific temperament encountering a particular mother. But something has gone very wrong very early, and the result is a character who comes to love that which is dead rather than alive. Fromm sees the parallels with what Freud called the anal sadistic character. Anality is a preoccupation with something dead. Feces are dead. Money, filthy lucre, like feces, is dead. Technology, steel and glass towers, an iPhone, a computer, an automobile. These are not living things. And Fromm sees Western society in the latter half of the 20th century as increasingly producing a necrophilic character type. He had been calling the predominant character type of mid-20th century Western society a marketing orientation, and that so the necrophilist character is a bit of an extension of the marketing character. They're both preoccupied with commodities and commodification and turning living things and people into objects, things that can be bought and sold, manipulated, exploited. But I think he's describing what he sees as a shift in the severity of this problem, an intensification of commodification, an intensification of the need for control. Living things are hard to control. If you make them dead, they're much easier to control. The mania for control and manipulation. So, Fromm gives a number of very interesting case studies. Joseph Stalin, Adolf Hitler, unfortunately, I think we have one of these types in the White House at the moment. And I guess here we come to what stimulated this video in the first place. I was watching a recent interview on the Gray Zone YouTube show. Erin Matte, young journalist whom I deeply respect, son of the Canadian physician Gabor Matte, who's written so brilliantly about addiction. Erin Matte, brilliant young journalist, courageous, award-winning, I think probably the first to expose the Russiagate conspiracy. Anyway, Erin Matte is interviewing Chomsky, and I was rather stunned, kind of astonished to hear Chomsky saying not only what many of us think, which is that this fool in the White House may end up destroying human life on this planet. I mean, his handling of the COVID-19 crisis has led to many deaths. But at the same time, he's refusing to renew various nuclear treaties with Russia. Well, he destroyed the treaty with Iran, of course, but now he's refusing to renew various long-standing nuclear treaties with Russia, which is probably going to stimulate the Russians into an arms race, which of course then will stimulate the military-industrial complex in America to have to match that, creating a terribly dangerous situation. And now, of course, he's He's replacing Russiagate with Chinagate, blaming COVID-19 on China and demonizing China increasingly in a very dangerous way. And so we know that this man's actions and poor decisions could well have terrible consequences, already has had terrible consequences for human beings and led to deaths. But Chomsky goes beyond seeing all of this destructiveness as an unintended consequence. He thinks it's intended. He says that Trump is the leader of a death cult, and he makes it very clear that he thinks that the Trumpian death cult is seeking the destruction of human life on this planet. Not accidentally leading to it, but intentionally bringing it about. Okay, I found that astonishing. So I went back and I reread Erich Fromm's The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness. And I very carefully reread the sections of that book from about page 250 on to page 400 and something, the end of the book. The sections on the necrophilic character. So this is a character who is attracted to death, attracted to decay, to decomposition, to extinction. This is a hatred of life. Like the anal character, this type of character is interested in piling up dead things, like money, like a fortune, like more and more profits. So that's the necrophilic character, and Trump certainly seems to fit that diagnosis. And the idea that he and others like him might actively be seeking to destroy human life on this planet by completely ignoring anthropogenic climate disruption, refusing to sign nuclear treaties, demonizing a powerful nuclear power, China. Many colleagues in psychiatry, although they're not supposed to diagnose a president, but they have gone ahead and done so, and have seen him as the pathological narcissist that he is. Well, this type of narcissism goes all the way to characterological necrophilia. Certainly, Chomsky perhaps has been reading Erich Fromm, but that certainly seems to be Noam Chomsky's diagnosis, and it's a frightening one.